Compucram contracts practice real estate and mandated disclosures. Once a contract has been rescinded, and each party returns to the other any consideration that has been tendered, what has occurred? Restitution. Correct. Replacement. Cancellation. Incorrect. Restoration. Restitution is rescission where the contract is undone, all obligations terminated, and all consideration returned. Cancellation is termination without undoing any of the acts that have been performed under the contract. In real property terminology, replacement may refer to rebuilding improvements to the same functional and economic value as before. Restoration may refer to reconstructing improvements to the same physical status and appearance as before. If the landlord and the area real estate manager of a national retailer both execute a lease, and the corporation fails to occupy the premises, what might prevent the landlord from enforcing the terms of contract? The broker did not have a written listing. Incorrect. No corporate resolution granting signing authority to the real estate manager was approved. Correct. The economy declined and the retailer was closing other stores. The real estate manager had authority to make the deal. Question rationale. A broker should always make sure, when the principals in a transaction are not personally executing binding documentation, that their representatives have full authority to commit the principal to the terms of the obligation. Neither favorable nor unfavorable general economic conditions are a required element of contracts, nor is the existence of a brokerage listing agreement. The landlord might, however, be able to claim damages from the retailer if the retailer's real estate manager said he had authority to sign and in doing so, exceeded the scope of his agency. What is the clause in a listing agreement that allows the broker to collect a commission, after the listing expires, if the seller sells to a prospect who has shown the home or had made an offer before the listing expired? Defeasance clause. Commission clause. Incorrect. Safety clause. Correct. Broker protection clause. Question rationale. When a broker supplies the seller with a list of prospective buyers who were shown the property during the listing, he or she can enforce the safety clause. Sellers negotiate a listing with a broker stating that if they find their own buyer, they can save the commission. However, if the broker, their agent, or any other brokerage firm finds the buyer, then the sellers will have to pay the broker's commission. What type of listing did the sellers and broker just negotiate? Non-listing. Open listing. Incorrect. Exclusive agency agreement. Correct. Exclusive right to sell. Question rationale. The exclusive agency agreement entitles the broker to a commission if anyone other than the seller finds a buyer. An exclusive right to sell listing entitles the broker to a commission if anyone, including the seller, finds a buyer. In the net listing, which is illegal or discouraged in many states, the seller sets a net amount he or she is willing to accept for the property, and the broker keeps any excess amount as commission. In an open, or non-exclusive listing, a seller makes an open offer to all brokers to find him a buyer and thus earn the commission. In a listing agreement, the sales agent is described as the agent. Incorrect. The principal. Buyer's agent. A subagent. Correct. Question rationale. An agent is a subagent in the listing. The listing belongs to the broker, and thus the broker is the agent. The sales agent is an agent of the broker and thus is sub or under the broker. The listing agreement is between the broker and the seller, not the buyer. Commissions are determined by broker policy. Incorrect. Federal law. State law. All commissions are negotiable. Correct. Who is authorized to rescind a voidable contract? Either party. Incorrect. The agent and the seller only. Only the minor. Correct. Neither. Only a void contract may be rescinded. Question rationale. Only a voidable contract may be rescinded, and only by the injured party. A minor is not held accountable in a real estate contract, and therefore may rescind the contract due to lack of contractual capacity. A void contract is not really a contract at all because it lacks one of the essential elements or is defective in some other way, and therefore is unenforceable. A listing agent shows a buyer a home. The buyer then fills out an offer to buy the home, which the listing agent takes and explains to the sellers. The sellers like the offer and sign their acceptance to it. They then hand the accepted offer to their agent with instructions to deliver the accepted contract back to the buyer. Has a contract been created? Yes, because the listing agent now has possession of the accepted offer. Yes, because the offer was accepted. No, because the sellers have not relinquished control of the acceptance. Correct. Yes, because the offer has been delivered to the buyer. Incorrect. Question rationale. Since the listing agent is under the control of the seller, there has not been delivery or communication of the acceptance. To be delivered, the contract must be out of the possession and control of the party accepting it. Even though the acceptance had left the seller's possession, it had not left their control. They could call the listing agent and tell him to bring back the accepted contract. A seller signs an exclusive agency agreement with a broker. The day after the listing is signed, the seller's brother-in-law decides to make an offer on the property, without knowing that the property has been listed. Which of the following statements is true? The seller will have to pay the commission to the broker. The broker is not entitled to a commission. Correct. The buyer will have to pay a commission. Since a buyer was found during the listing period, the broker will be entitled to a commission. Question rationale. Under an exclusive agency agreement, the broker is entitled to a commission only if the broker or another agency finds a buyer for the seller. In this situation, the seller found the buyer, so he does not owe a commission. If this were an exclusive right to sell listing, then the seller would have to pay the broker a commission, no matter who found the buyer. Which of the following is not an essential element of a real estate contract? Valuable consideration. Incorrect. Good consideration. Correct. Offer and acceptance. Lawful and possible objective. Question rationale. A contract must be supported by valuable consideration, that is money, real estate, jewelry, etc. Good consideration is usually in the form of love and affection, and while it is not without value, its readily ascertainable value cannot be calculated. Contracts must have offer, acceptance, valuable consideration, lawful and possible objective, and competent parties. Who does not have to sign the lease? Lessee. Correct. Landlord. Broker. Incorrect. Lessor. Question rationale. This is an easy question if you can remember who is the lessor and who is the lessee. In California, only the lessor has to sign the lease. Taking possession is considered acceptance by the lessee. A subdivision developer employs agents to sell lots. John, a licensed agent, offers to buy lot B3 for $20,000, and a sales contract is executed. However, through a typographical error, which no one noticed, the contract identified the lot as D3, which was listed at $25,000. What is the contract status? Void. Incorrect. Voidable. Correct. Enforceable. Invalid. Question rationale. All agents and all parties to a transaction should read carefully all binding documents, and the document is prima facie evidence of the agreement. Having an agent does not relieve the client of responsibility. A mistake that is mutual, material, unintentional and free from negligence may cause the contract to be voidable, in this case by the developer, though he may decide to honor the deal. John, as a licensed broker, is held to a higher standard by the canon of ethics, and because of that, the court might not uphold his action for specific performance. Who is responsible for determining whether or not a property is located in an officially mapped natural hazard zone? Buyer's agent. Incorrect. Seller and seller's agent. Correct. Public official. Buyer. Question rationale. The seller and listing agent are responsible for determining if a property is in an officially mapped natural hazard zone. Seller S, listed with broker L, sells her home to buyer B for $200,000. Buyer B is represented by his own buyer's agent. An earnest money check for $2,000 is attached to the contract. After both parties have fully executed the contract, broker L deposits the check into his escrow account, per the contract instructions. 2 days later, L receives notice that the check is being returned for insufficient funds. What should L do first? Cover the check out of his own funds and then contact B to repay him. Contact B immediately to get the check covered. Contact S immediately and notify her of the bad check. Correct. Contact the buyer's agent immediately to get a new check. Incorrect. Question rationale. Although L will probably need to contact several people, the first call should be to his client, seller, as he owes her the duty of full disclosure. A bad check could possibly nullify the transaction. Which of the following is not grounds for revocation or suspension of a license? Violation of the Code of Ethics. Correct. Violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Violation of the Canons of Ethics. Incorrect. Violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Question rationale. The Code of Ethics is a set of voluntary rules of conduct established by the National Association of Realtors. The Federal Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 are both federal statutes, and the Canons of Ethics list the ethics laws of individual states. Which act prohibits discrimination by businesses? Under Civil Rights Act. Correct. The Holden Act. Rumford Act. Class Act. Question rationale. The Under Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination by businesses. In the 1968 landmark U.S. Supreme Court case of Jones v. Meyer, it was ruled that racial discrimination in the sale of any property is prohibited, without exceptions. Correct. The Fair Housing Act is void. Sexual preference is now a protected class in fair housing laws. State law shall take precedence over the Federal Fair Housing Act. Question rationale. The Jones v. Meyer case interpreted the Civil Rights Act of 1866, not the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Supreme Court found that when it comes to racial discrimination in the rental, sale of housing and personal property, there are no exceptions or exemptions to the 1866 law, even though there were 4 exceptions in the 1968 Act. Statements not known to be untrue at the time they are made are called actual fraud. Innocent misrepresentation. Correct. Fraudulent misrepresentation. Negligent misrepresentation. Incorrect. Question rationale. Innocent misrepresentations are statements not known to be untrue at the time they are made. An agent is usually not liable, although the buyer or seller could cancel a contract over it. If an investigation determines a violation of the Rumford Act, an owner can be made to do all of the following except: the owner must complete the rental or sale. The owner must pay up to $1,000 in damages. The owner must convey title to the victim. Correct. The complainant is entitled to the next available unit. Incorrect. Question rationale. The owner must pay damages, offer the next available unit, or complete the sale. Who appoints the Real Estate Advisory Commission? The Real Estate Commissioner. Correct. Director of Commerce. Public election. The Governor. Incorrect. Question rationale. The Governor appoints the Real Estate Commissioner, who appoints the Real Estate Advisory Commission. The commission consists of 6 brokers and 4 members of the public. When the seller asks the broker to keep a latent defect to herself, the broker refuses. What code contains the ethical guidelines for the broker? Civil Code. Criminal Code. NAR Code of Ethics. Incorrect. Business and Professions Code. Correct. Question rationale. A broker would rely on the Business and Professions Code of Ethics. 2 brokers get together at a breakfast meeting and decide they will each agree to work in certain geographical areas of the town. Which of the following statutes have been violated? Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Civil Rights Law. Federal Housing Antitrust Law. Sherman Antitrust Act. Correct. Question rationale. The Sherman Antitrust Act prohibits monopolization. Price fixing and market fixing would be 2 examples of a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. While walking through a home, a buyer notices a large crack in the wall. The seller does not disclose this item on any property disclosure statement. After the sale is completed, the buyer sues the seller for the necessary repairs of the crack in the wall. The buyer has no claim, under the doctrine of caveat emptor. Correct. The seller is liable for failing to note the crack on the applicable property disclosure form. Incorrect. A seller is never liable for repair defects after the closing. The seller is liable to make the repairs. Question rationale. Under the doctrine of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. The buyer must examine goods or property and buy at his own risk. Any patent defect does not need to be disclosed by the seller, as it is readily viewable by the buyer and the buyer takes the property subject to the defect. A latent defect needs to be disclosed by the seller either directly to the buyer or on the property disclosure form. As this is a patent defect, there is no liability on behalf of the seller. Where would one file a complaint based on the Rumford Act? OEO. In EECP. Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Correct. ECHA. Incorrect. Question rationale. A complaint based on the Rumford Act can be filed with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Potential buyers believe they have been discriminated against because of their race. What option is available to the buyers under the Federal Fair Housing Act? File a lawsuit within 2 years and complain to the Office of Equal Opportunity, HUD, within 1 year. Correct. File a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission. File a lawsuit within 2 years. Complain to the Office of Equal Opportunity, HUD, within 1 year. Incorrect. Question rationale. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act, victims have the right either to file a complaint with the Office of Equal Housing Opportunity, HUD, within 1 year of the incident, or to file a lawsuit within the courts within 2 years of the incident. The Federal Trade Commission handles complaints under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Compucram transfer of property. In the closing statement required by RESPA, the sales commission is shown as a debit to the buyer, credit to the buyer, debit to the seller. Correct. Credit to the seller. Question rationale. The sales commission is paid by the seller at closing and thus reduces his net from the sale of the property, so this is a debit to him. Who has the authority to change escrow instructions? Broker. Incorrect. Buyer. Seller. Buyer and seller together. Correct. Question rationale. Neither buyer nor seller can unilaterally change escrow instructions, and no broker can change them. Only the buyer and seller together can change escrow instructions. A quitclaim deed conveys only the interest of the vendee. The grantor. Correct. Property. Incorrect. The grantee. Question rationale. The grantor and the grantee are the parties to a deed. A quitclaim deed transfers the interest of the grantor only. A grantee does not sign a deed. A vendee is the buyer in a land contract. When the loan is paid, who conveys the deed of reconveyance to whom? Truster to trustee. Trustee to truster. Correct. Vendor to vendee. Grantor to grantee. Question rationale. A deed of reconveyance is used to convey title from trustee to truster. What does a title company do? Transfer title from grantor to grantee. Hold escrow. Ensure clear title to real property. Correct. Convey equitable title from vendor to vendee. Incorrect. Question rationale. The title company ensures clear title to real property by examining the title and making sure the chain of title is correct. In a real estate sales transaction, title to real estate passes from the seller to the buyer by execution of a deed by the seller and delivery to the buyer. Correct. Possession of the property. All of the answers. Recordation of the deed. Incorrect. Question rationale. A title, ownership, passes from seller to buyer when the deed is delivered to the buyer and accepted by the buyer. A deed need not be recorded to effect transfer of title. What kind of title does the vendee have? Quiet title. Equitable title. Correct. Bare legal title. Naked title. Question rationale. The vendee, when entering into a land contract, does not get legal title until the terms of the land contract have been met. Before that time, the buyer has equitable title. Which of the following statements concerning a settlement or closing statement is true? The Realtor's Commission is a credit to the buyer's side of a closing statement. A closing statement is a simultaneous listing of debits and credits to the respective buyer and seller. Correct. There is a corresponding credit for a buyer and debit for a seller on all charges on closing. There is a corresponding debt for a seller and credit for a buyer for all charges on a closing statement. Question rationale. A closing statement does not include corresponding debits and credits to either buyer or seller. A closing statement presents a final, detailed accounting of a real estate transaction, listing each party's debits and credits and the amount each will receive or be required to pay at closing. This is not an accountant's balance sheet in which each debit has a corresponding credit and vice versa. On a closing settlement statement, the buyer's mortgage is a debit to the buyer. Incorrect. A credit to the buyer. Correct. A credit to the seller. A debit to the seller. Question rationale. People often think of a mortgage as a debt, but on the closing statement it is actually a credit to the buyer, as it reduces the amount of money that the buyer actually has to bring to the closing table. Who acknowledges a deed? Notary. Incorrect. Grantor. Correct. Vendee. Grantee. Question rationale. A grantor acknowledges that he voluntarily executed a deed in front of a notary. The notary does not acknowledge the deed, but rather takes the acknowledgement of the grantor. The grantee does not sign the deed, nor does the vendee, who is the buyer in a land installment contract. Which of the following is necessary for a valid grant deed? Competent grantee. Legal description. Words of granting. Correct. Acknowledgement. Incorrect. Question rationale. A grantee does not need to be competent, he or she can be a minor, for example. A grant deed must contain words of granting. Who is the trustee, and what title, if any, does he or she hold? The neutral third party, who holds bare legal title. Correct. The borrower, who holds equitable title. Incorrect. The lender, who holds bare legal title. The lender, who holds equitable title. Question rationale. The trustee, a third party, holds bare legal title until reconveyance or foreclosure. Title to real estate is transferred when a deed is delivered and accepted. Correct. Acknowledged. Signed. Recorded. Question rationale. While a deed must be signed by the grantor and acknowledged by the grantor in front of a notary, a deed does not have to be recorded. The transfer of title occurs when the deed is handed to the buyer and the buyer accepts. Compucram practice of real estate and mandated disclosures. An untrue statement made by an agent who knows he or she is not telling the truth is known as constructive fraud. Negligent misrepresentation. Incorrect. Innocent misrepresentation. Fraudulent misrepresentation. Correct. Question rationale. When an agent knowingly makes an untrue statement, he or she commits fraudulent misrepresentation. The agent could be found guilty of fraud. An agent checks the public record and discovers an addition on his new listing was built without a permit. What should the agent do? Be loyal to the seller. Don't say anything. Inform any interested buyers. Correct. Keep the information confidential. Talk with his broker. Incorrect. Question rationale. An agent should always be diligent and look for red flags, such as the addition in question. Red flags must be disclosed to any interested buyers. Which of the following could a real estate agent lawfully prepare? A lease. None of the answers correct. A land contract. A real estate purchase contract. A licensee is working with a buyer as a customer. The buyer has the agent write an offer. When must the agent give a copy of the offer to the buyer? When the buyer signs the agency disclosure form. Incorrect. When the seller signs the offer without any changes, because this is notification. Whenever the agent has time to make a copy and deliver it to the buyer's home. As soon as the buyer signs it. Correct. Question rationale. Licenses are suspended daily because licensees do not give copies of signed documents to the signing party immediately. How long must a broker keep transaction files? 5 years. Incorrect. 10 years. 4 years. 3 years. Correct. Question rationale. Real estate law requires records to be kept for a period of 3 years. A tenant hasn't paid rent for more than a month. How much notice must a landlord give the tenant to terminate tenancy? 30 days. Incorrect. 90 days. 60 days. 3 days. Correct. Question rationale. While rule-abiding tenants must get 30 days notice to terminate tenancy, delinquent tenants can be given as little as 3 days notice.